Minsk.
China's economic rise has been an engine of growth for the world, but Beijing's growing authoritarianism and assertiveness in foreign affairs is prompting a pushback. Now on BBC World News, how countries around the world are navigating China. Talking Business Asia.
From this to this in just a few decades. China has become an economic powerhouse, fueling growth for millions, not just in China, but also outside. A key engine of the global economy. This new, confident, modern China is now also a key global player, flexing its muscles on the international stage, upending the global status quo. Countries around the world are trying to figure out how to navigate China without risking a fight.
If you are going to have a disagreement with Beijing, as many governments around the world now are doing, it's far better to arrive at that position conjointly with other countries and other governments around the world, rather than unilaterally.
Welcome to Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. In recent years, the relationship between China and the United States has deteriorated, resulting in a tit-for-tat game of tariffs and sanctions. But it's perhaps with Australia where China's gloves have really come off. The country is one of China's biggest trade partners, but tension between the two has seen trade agreements cancelled and businesses struggling with the fallout. In a moment, we'll hear more from our special guest, the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. But first, this report from our Australia correspondent Shaima Khalil.
At Chateau Tanunda, they've been making wine for 130 years. And for more than a decade, they've cultivated a strong relationship with China. But this has changed dramatically over the past year. Beijing imposed huge tariffs on Australian wine, and sales dried up.
It's terribly disappointing. We have made so much inroads into China over 15 years, relationships, people. These things take a long time to build, trust of the consumer in your products, and then to suddenly hit a roadblock like this. Unfortunately, that's 15 years' work down the drain.
Beijing justified the tariff, saying that Australia was dumping wine onto the Chinese market, creating unfair competition, something that officials here have strongly denied. But this is not just about wine. This is a pattern of aggressive Chinese action that has hit other industries and hurt many exporters in the past few months.
Australian rock lobster is a luxury delicacy. Most of it went to China, but a ban last year devastated the industry. There have been restrictions too on goods including beef, barley and coal, as well as threats to boycott tourism and universities, both heavily dependent on the Chinese market.
Since China became Australia's largest trading partner in the early 2000s, we just haven't seen a point quite as dark as this. I think it's particularly striking that there's no real political contact at senior levels. We're now seeing economic dialogue cut off at senior levels.
This downward spiral began in 2017, after Canberra accused Beijing of meddling in Australian politics and society. A year later, Australia blocked Chinese telecoms giant Huawei from the country's 5G network. And China was pushed over the edge when Australia explicitly called for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19.
Australian business and Australian politicians are all much more aware of some of the challenges of dealing with China. And no longer can that fiction be maintained between an economic relationship and the security concerns.
One Australian product China cannot get enough of is iron ore, crucial for its ever-expanding infrastructure. About 2/3 of Chinese imports come from here.
China's not so angry with Australia that it is going to blow up its own interests, but over time, more options do open up. And as China's economy moves towards a consumption-driven model rather than an investment-driven one, it's simply its own demand for iron ore will fall as well.
While there is public support for the government's tough stance on China, critics say Australia has not dealt with the crisis wisely.
I would describe the handling of China at the moment as inept. Plenty of countries have challenges with China, many far more acute than those that Australia has. If Canberra showed a bit of self-reflection, they would understand that at least some of the responsibility does stem from policy decisions and diplomatic choices that we've made.
Back at Chateau Tanunda, a reminder of happier times. China's President Xi Jinping drinking the winemaker's best Shiraz. Local customers, including the Chinese-Australian community, are ever more crucial now. As here and across the country, exporters look beyond Beijing for more welcoming markets. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Barossa Valley, South Australia.
Well, as you saw there in Shaima's report, Australian businesses are suffering. So was pushing back on China the right strategy for Australia? And what can other countries learn from Australia's experience? Kevin Rudd has grappled with a lot of these issues when he was the Prime Minister of Australia. He joins me now from Brisbane. Welcome to the programme, Mr. Rudd. How badly are Australian businesses being hit by the current government's pushback against China?
Well, it takes two to tango in this business. China has taken a number of punitive measures against Australia, and the Australian government, of course, has been responding as it judges fit. But on the bottom line of the impact on corporates, it does depend on the sector of the Australian economy that we're talking about. On the one hand, iron ore prices are still going through the roof, and that's because China's demand for iron ore remains very high. But when you look at other discretionary sectors of the Australian economy, obviously, for example, international students, notwithstanding the current COVID restrictions, but in further consumer areas as well, such as wine products, the impact is being felt in a real and concrete way on the ground by Australian businesses and universities.
How bad could it get between the two countries? Could we see iron ore on the table, for instance, as something that China holds up as a tool of punishment?
Well, China faces an international market reality that if China could diversify its imports of iron ore tomorrow, it would, but it can't. It can't get sufficient supply out of Brazil. So the damage to the Australian iron ore industry will not be now. I believe it will be medium term. The takeout message, I believe, for the Chinese political leadership will be they will see Australia as an unreliable supplier of iron ore long term because of the geopolitical conclusions that Beijing will make in relation to Canberra, or at least the Conservative government in Canberra, that long-term supply may be put at risk because of geopolitical factors.
Mr. Rudd, when you were Prime Minister, arguably Australia-China relations were at a relative high. Given what we see today, though, with the way that China is acting, were you too naive and optimistic about China's trajectory?
Not at all. If you look at the history of our government, we had rolling disagreements with Beijing about every conceivable thing. However, the manner in which we conducted our relationship with Beijing at the time was professional, it was diplomatic, it was hardline, but we also managed to preserve the overall balance of the relationship. Since then, of course, Xi Jinping has had a much greater period of time in office and has become more assertive than he was in the past. And the Australian government's Conservative government's response to the Chinese has from time to time been measured, but at other times, frankly, has been rhetorical and shrill. If you are going to have a disagreement with Beijing, as many governments around the world now are doing, it's far better to arrive at that position conjointly with other countries and other governments around the world, rather than unilaterally, because it makes it easier for China to exert bilateral leverage against you if that's the case.
What's your advice to companies and countries who want to do business with China but also want to raise these issues?
Well, the bottom line is it's always been a red line for China. I've had many disagreements with China on human rights in the past. My first visit to Beijing as Prime Minister, I delivered an address at Peking University in Chinese, criticizing China's human rights performance in Tibet. It was not welcome, but it was a necessary thing to do. For corporations, this is a much harder terrain to navigate, particularly given recent events in Xinjiang, continuing events in Tibet, and again, recent developments in Hong Kong. Again, my advice to corporates would be if there is to be a position to be taken by corporates, it's better if that is anchored in peak industry organisations within countries, either the United States, the United Kingdom or elsewhere, rather than necessarily an individual corporation taking the lead. That's not a complete solution, but it's one way of advancing the debate.
From what you're saying, it sounds like working together as a global community to put forward these issues to China is perhaps the solution. How do you think China might react to that?
Well, China won't like it because China would wish to leverage other countries bilaterally to either silence them on questions of human rights or silence them on questions of alliance obligations to the United States. But the fact that China doesn't like something doesn't necessarily mean the rest of us shouldn't do it.
What's the single biggest misconception, Mr. Rudd, about China's rise, do you think?
When people analyse China's rise, they seem to do it almost exclusively through the prism of how that rise impacts them externally. Now, that's natural and that's normal. But in the analysis of China and its rise, we need to be equally clear about the domestic drivers of China's own political and economic and foreign policy evolution. Because if we do that, we'll also arrive at an analytical conclusion that China domestically faces an enormous set of constraints and challenges itself. They won't impede or ultimately prevent China's rise, but they are important factors for us to bear in mind when we analyse China's own vulnerabilities. I think assuming that China is always 10 feet tall on everything is an analytical error, which can produce, therefore, policy errors as well.
Thank you for joining us, Kevin Rudd, on this program. We're going to take a quick break now. Coming up next, I'll host a special panel looking at how countries like the US and China can work together to thaw relations and build trade ties.
With a bang, energy and change came to every part of our universe. Seismic or small, it continues.
Change is all around us, shaped by technology and human ingenuity. We can make it work for you and your business.
Welcome to Doha from every one of us, even those working quietly behind the scenes, so you can relax and enjoy the perfect break in your journey. And when you leave with a smile, we know our day's work is done. Qatar Airways, welcome to our home.
Welcome back to Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. China is possibly the most critical economic relationship for companies and countries. In 2020, by its own estimates, China's economy accounted for 17% of global GDP, right behind the US. It's now also the world's second largest importer, buying just over $2 trillion worth of goods. Take Australia, for example. In the last 20 years, a fifth of Australia's total exports have gone to China, much of that in commodities. Yet negative perceptions of China are at their highest level in many countries. 73% of people surveyed in the West and among China's key trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, Australia, and South Korea, had unfavorable or somewhat unfavorable perceptions of China. But are these perceptions unfounded and discriminatory, as Beijing says they are? What does the world need to understand about China's growing economic power and how it uses that influence? To answer those questions and more, I'm joined by Wendy Cutler, who's the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and a former U.S. trade negotiator, and Huayao Henry Wang, founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization and an advisor to the Chinese government. Good to see the both of you, and thank you for joining us on this program. Henry, there are many who say that China's rise should be feared, not welcomed. What would you say to that?
Well, I think that there's probably quite a bit of a misunderstanding as well. I think there's a lot of communication needs to be done, and a lot of dialogues needs to be done. Of course, China also needs to improve its narratives, its more better communications. So I think there's a host of issues that maybe contribute to this negative. But most of all, I think also President Trump's last 4 years in the office certainly didn't help as well, because he was started this trade war.
Wendy, Henry says this is about narratives and about changing the world perception on China. Do you agree with that view?
Well, when I think about should China be feared, I don't think that's really the correct word. I think there's a lot of concern in the United States and in other parts of the world about China and the perception that China is not living up to the global rules, that as it rises, it's making up its own rules and it's trying to convince the world to change the rules in order to facilitate China's rise. And so I think, again, great concern about China. On the other hand, I think China has done us, the United States at least, a service, is really being a wake-up call. And the United States does need to do more at home to build its strength, to become more competitive, to improve its education system, its infrastructure, and its overall economy. So, China's here to stay. We're going to need to figure out how to live in a world with China, but we need a China that lives by the global rules.
Henry, a China that lives by the global rules. Do you think that's fair, that assessment, that China doesn't play by the rules?
I think China has said that they're going to, stick to the United Nations Charter, and also China wants to play the WTO rules and things like that. China never said they're not going to play the rule, but I think it's right. There's a changing world. There's a changing demand and the perception. China is also developing as well. So I think we need to find a new, probably better rules on that. I think probably in the past that China can still do better. Of course, that's why China said, okay, it's willing to join the CPTPP. I know that Wendy is the one of the chief architects of TPP, and so China is willing to learn and adapt and continue to improve. I think that we can probably work towards that objective in the future.
Henry, what is the value of economic agreements that China signs when, at the first inkling of the other country, Australia in this case, for instance, disagreeing or raising issues of human rights, China can just tear up that agreement and say, no, thank you, I'm not playing ball anymore?
Australia has been saying things on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, but I think China felt it's not really accurate, sometimes even probably fabricated on that. So I understand there's probably actions on both sides, but I agree. It's we need to sort it out. We need to have a better dialogue.
Wendy, when you hear that from Henry, that this is about getting down to the table, talking all of this stuff out. In your role as trade negotiator, you've sat across from Chinese negotiators. What's your sense of the best way to get to a deal with China?
Well, first, reaching a deal with any trading partner is a tough slog. And with China, in all the negotiations I've been in, they've been tough as well. We're really at a juncture where we need to update the WTO rules to really reflect the realities of the day, whether that be with respect to government subsidies or to intellectual property protection or to technology transfer. I think that is an avenue where we can work together cooperatively if indeed China, is open to improving, strengthening, and updating those rules I mentioned.
So Henry, why not? Why not do what Wendy has suggested? Reform so that you do become recognized as a developed economy.
Yeah, I think Wendy is right. I think that exactly. I think China wants also to strengthen WTO, and we hope that we can get more new consensus, new agreement, and also push for new agenda. For example, there's digital economy, facilitation of investment, and also the anti-pollution of plastic into ocean and things like that. You know, there are many things I think WTO can do if China and US can work together with other EU and other countries. So I agree. WTO is really the most strong platform that we should really stick to.
So are you saying that China will change its stance at the WTO and accept that it needs to play and operate on a level playing field with the rest of the world?
Well, China never said that China doesn't want to reform WTO. I mean, it always wants to reform WTO, but I think, you know, it's some of the fundamental rules there are still there. Things that I think what probably the U.S. the Trump administration at least has been pulling out of the WTO, threatening and paralyze the appellate body of that. You know, those things like that are really not helping, and also many things. I'm glad to see Biden administration is taking a bit more active now. China also has signed a phase 1 deal with U.S. You know, probably we could talk about phase 2. I mean, the new USTR is talking about that. I mean, China is welcoming on that. So there's many ways we can work together.
Wendy, what is the most important thing that countries need to understand when they're dealing with China?
The most important, I think we need to recognize that China is a rising power. It's a very strong and dynamic and innovative economy. And you can't look at things in, you know, very simplistic terms as black or white, decouple or open or integrate. It's very complex. But again, we're both, you know, the two largest economies in the world. We should find areas where we share interest. And one of the areas we have not mentioned in this interview is the whole issue of COVID recovery. The one thing I would just like to underscore, you know, Henry keeps talking about we need to talk more, we need more dialogue. I think from the US perspective, talking's fine, but action's more important. And there's urgency to these problems. I think if we're going to do something in the World Trade Organization, we need to do this soon. We need to show results, or else I think the United States is going to become very frustrated, lose patience, and then kind of look for a plan B with other countries.
Henry, what would you say to that? What can Chinese policymakers do to reassure the international community that China will play by the rules?
Well, I think China, you know, largely, certainly, you know, is willing to play by the rule. I mean, that has been demonstrated in the last number of years. I mean, you know, it takes a bit of time, but also I do recognize there's a big cultural difference. You know, China has its unique culture, Oriental culture, Confucius culture, 5,000 years history. There's a lot of understanding, you know, needs to be clarified. For example, this pandemic fighting, China's practice, you know, very restricted lockdown and, you know, maybe sacrifice a little bit of individual freedom, but then you gain a very large society freedom, and China now is really the most free in terms of fighting pandemic. Anywhere you go, travel, you know, tourism is booming here. China said many times China wants to uphold the United Nations Charter of Rights. China wants to stick to the international, you know, rules that UN-based. And also other international agencies. China never started the sanction on any others. China is passively responding to the sanctions, but that's getting into the problem. So we have to avoid that. I think that we need to find a way to solve that. That's probably the right way. But all the agreement China signed, we should stick to that and practice better for that.
Wendy Cutler, Henry Wang, thank you so much for joining us on the program today. Well, that's it for this edition of Talking Business Asia. I'm Karishma Vaswani. Send me your thoughts on @BBC Karishma. From me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching.